calm down. Everybody, please take your seats. We know there's a lot of excitement in the virtual rooms on today. We got so many great things in store, and we'll get going once you lower your voices. There you go. Welcome to this month's Triangle, North Carolina Gun Club's monthly meeting. Also, the Triangle chapter of NAAGA. As you know, we are still and always will be forever NAAGA strong. Today, we're going to address some critical things that a lot of folks have been pinging on in our chats and in our different threads as it relates to the process of ammo reloading. And so we are going to get started, and we're just going to jump right in with the Triangle, North Carolina Gun Club members' very own Cap Hayes. Cap has dedicated some time today to give us an overview of the process of reloading. And so please, we encourage everyone, get a pen, get some paper, take some notes so that you can get all the detail that you're going to need. At the conclusion of today's session, Cap is going to go live on the Triangle NC Facebook fan page where he will be able to address any of your questions. So if you are not following the Triangle NC Gun Club's Facebook fan page, we encourage you to do so that you can get the responses to any of the questions that you may have on today. But before we get started, as always, we like to make sure that we prioritize safety and keep safety first. We just want to go on the 5 basic fundamental safety rules when we're dealing with firearms. And first of all, we want to make sure that everyone is treating every gun as if it were loaded. Second, we always want to make sure that we are pointing any firearm in a safe direction and that we would never point a gun at anything that we do not intend to shoot or to destroy. As always, keep your finger off of the trigger until you are ready to engage your target. And then, of course, be sure to know what is behind the target that is in your line of sight. Having said that and gone through our rules, let's get into the meat of the matter. So Cap Hayes, take it away. We're ready to learn. And don't forget, at the conclusion, go live onto the Facebook page because Cap will be answering any questions that you might have as it relates to today's reloading process and demonstration. Thanks for joining and thanks for hanging with us. Remember, stay NAAGA strong and let's learn. Each one teach one. The more we learn, the more we can grow together. Take it away, Cap.
Going from the beginning, the things that you've got to have to do this, what we're going to talk about, what's laid out here, is not necessarily everything that you'll end up buying. It's not everything that I own by any means, or even everything that I use every time that I reload, but it's kind of what I thought the basics of what you've got to have to load at least handgun efficiently. We are going to do 9mm today. Most of this is also going to apply to rifle. There are some things that are a little bit different rifle, but you know, the basics are all the same. What you're going to need to start out with, no matter if you load handgun or rifle or both, is a really good manual. Okay, you can't just follow YouTube videos or forum posts or something like that. You got to have a good book. Your book gives you safety info. It gives you step-by-step instructions from selecting your brass, checking your brass after it's been fired, all the way through constructing a cartridge and then also checking your brass again after you've shot it to look for signs that you did something wrong or that you have problems. So you got to have a book. I usually tell people to get the Hornady book or the Lyman book. This is a 49th edition Lyman book. The newest one is 50th. And I just want to mention that really quickly because I have the 50th. It's just on Kindle. If you get an older book from, a lot of times if someone used to reload or they thought they were going to and they decided not to, they find out you're getting into it, they'll offer you their old books. The old books are cool. But at least in the beginning, before you have a lot of frame of reference for data, don't use old load data. Make sure you have one current book that you use the data from, and you can also use the data that your powder manufacturers or even your bullet manufacturers publish if they publish it for free. Powder manufacturers all publish free data, which is why I will tell everyone don't buy the Lee book because the Lee book just uses free data. They don't do any of their own testing. All the other books, they're all pretty good. The Lyman book's the one I always tell people to get because it has the most bullet types and powders, especially for handguns, and it has lead data. So bullet construction, there's only 4 parts to your bullet. There's your brass case, there's your primers, there's your powder, and then there's your bullets that go into the case. When you're selecting load data, there's 3 kind of bullet characteristics that you need to consider when you're picking the right data for the right bullet. One is the bullet weight. That's what most of us think about when we think of different kinds of bullets, especially for pistols, 115 grains or 124 grains, 147, etc. So you got to get the right weight, bullet weight, load data, okay? Don't mix and match those. If you don't have 115 grain data, go buy another book or whatever it takes to get the right weight data. Also important is your bullet shape. We'll try to get, I don't know if this is going to come into focus or not. Here we have 2 jacketed 115 grain bullets, but one is a full metal jacket round nose bullet and one is a hollow point bullet. Your bullet shape is important in the kind of load data that you're using. You can run into trouble sometimes if you try to, say, load a full metal jacket bullet with hollow point data or vice versa. Probably most of the time you won't run into safety issues. It's possible, but you might run into erratic pressures, erratic velocities, accuracy issues, etc. And the reason why is because these are actually different lengths, even though they're the same weight. And so if you follow the data exactly, your overall length of your cartridge would be the same, but one bullet will sit further in the case than the other. And so, that might create more or less pressure inside the case. And in some cases, if you have like a slightly compressed load, which you probably, as starting out, you probably shouldn't start with compressed loads, but in some cases, the bullet might actually not fit, which is the case, in fact, if you use copper bullets. Solid copper bullets are not so popular in pistols right now, but they are around. They're lighter than lead, and so if you buy the same weight copper bullet, it's longer, and so it might not even fit in the case if you try to use jacketed data or lead data for it. And it's really possible, like Hornady, for example, all these boxes look like really similar, and they don't always have very descriptive names for their bullets, so you might actually buy copper bullets and not realize it until you get it home. So make sure you're using the right kind of bullet. Kind of the other major bullet type or construction type would be lead. This is cast lead. They're using 38s and 357s. Most semi-auto shooters probably don't think that they're going to use lead. It is possible unless your pistol manufacturer tells you not to, like Glock does. But even if you have a pistol that doesn't shoot lead, you probably still want access to lead data because you can also buy what's called plated bullets. And plated bullets have a really thin copper wash on them. Typically, sometimes it's thicker, but most plated bullets can't be used with jacketed load data. You have to use lead data. And they might be all you can find. They might also be just cheaper, so you want to shoot them anyways. But also, the kind of powder that you can find might dictate what kind of bullets you want to shoot. So like HS6, we mostly only use in jacketed loads for 9mm. Unique you can use in jacketed or lead pretty interchangeably. There's loads for both, I should say. But something like if you found a really good deal on red dot, or if it was the only powder that's left, I've never run across jacketed data for 9mm for it, but there is lead data, so depending on what you can get your hands on might determine what kind of bullets you shoot, right? Or depending on what bullets you shoot might determine what kind of powder you buy, etc. Don't get stuck on, I have to have, one specific load that I found in my book that I think is the best, because right now you probably won't even be able to buy it. Just make the best with what you've got. So The load book's important. You should have some kind of data log. You can use a notebook. You could use a Excel spreadsheet. You can download some PDFs that are pretty good, like Reading. But you need to keep meticulous data, including the lot numbers from your powder and primers, because when those lots change, you want to rework up your loads each time. You don't want to just use the maximum load from some old lot of powder or something like that, because it can change. As far as the actual tools that are laid out here and the setup here, we're in my kitchen. I've just got this clamped down to my kitchen island, which is pretty stable and pretty heavy, so it doesn't move around a lot. If you have a space that you can't dedicate to a reloading bench, so you have a computer desk that you want to use, or an island like this, or a short wall, or a countertop or something, you can do something like this where you mount to a sturdy board and then you just clamp it down, and it works quite well. The presses that we've got laid out here are both single stage presses. All the loading we're going to do is on a single stage press. We'll talk a little bit about progressives, which is the other one you hear a lot about in a little bit, but all the steps are basically the same, and you should probably start out on a single stage press. I won't push it too hard, but I do think that almost everyone should just start on a single stage press. Single stage means when you get your reloading dies, it only does one die operation at a time. So you have a resizing die that squishes this brass back down because it expanded after you shot it. You have a die that flares it out so you can drop a bullet in it easily, etc. On a single stage, you can only do one of those operations, right? You move this one time, it runs a case through, you take it off, you put another case in, you do the same operation. On a progressive press, all of those dies sit on the top, and each time you move this lever up and down, it runs every case that's on a shell holder, or shell plate, into all of the dies, and turns it and runs it again. And so the idea is, once you've done the first step enough times that the shell plate is filled up, which is just a plate that you put that holds, like, depending on the size of your press, like 4 to 8 cases. Once it's full, every time you crank this, you're going to get a round out of it. And that's kind of how you get the speed. There's more to it than that. You can get case feeder attachments and bullet feeder attachments, and all those things speed it up. They also cost you money. Okay, so single stage, we're just doing one of those operations at a time. Instead of a shell plate like you have on a progressive, a single stage just has what's called a shell holder. It holds your casing. It is somewhat caliber specific. You can't put a 40 Smith & Wesson case in a 9mm, or you can't put a 357 in there, for example. The reason you got to know about that is your press kit might come with them, it might not. Your dies, if you buy Lee dies, I know that they do come with a shell holder for the caliber that you bought, but some other dies don't. Okay, so just know about it, because you might have to buy a pack of them. They're not super expensive, but it's just something you might have to buy that doesn't come in a kit or come with your dies. There's really not much else to a single stage press. It comes with everything else here, except for the dies. We'll jump into the dies really quick. For pistols, usually you have 3 or 4 die sets. For rifles, it's usually 2 or 3 dies. There's not really much difference between 3 die sets and 4 die sets for pistols. They're all pretty high quality. They all do the same things. The only real difference is, like, the Lee 4 die sets come with a separate, what they call a factory crimp die, whereas most 3 die sets, the crimping operation is done at the same time that the bullet is seated. And we'll talk about all those steps later. But that's basically the only difference. The one thing that you really want to focus on with dies is you got to get carbide dies. Just get them. Unless they're just not available for your caliber, get carbide dies. They last longer. They're way smoother to use. In a lot of pistol calibers, they don't require any lube, although I use lube anyways. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. Other things to note, the Lee dies are always the cheapest. They put out, they work fine, they make good ammo, but they're a little more fiddly. They don't have locking adjustments the same way that more expensive dies do. So you can save some money on the lead dies, but it does come at, in my opinion, a little bit of an efficiency cost. RCBS dies are really great. I love RCBS as a company because they have really great customer service. Like, this is a 40-year-old press. I was missing this little plastic primer catcher. I called them to ask them to buy one, and they just mailed it to me. So cool company, and they make really great products. Aside from your dies and your press, the other kind of tools that we have laid out here that we're going to use today, and you almost definitely have to have, you need a way to weigh powder and measure powder. This is a digital scale. I got really lucky with this one. It just happens to be very accurate and cheap. Most of the cheap digital scales are hit or miss as to whether or not they're very accurate. So if you buy a kit that has a digital scale instead of a balance scale, make sure that you check it. It'll come with a check weight. So make sure that it's correct when you first get it out of the box, but then also leave the weight on it and see if it drifts over time, several hours or even overnight. And if it does, send it back and get a new one. You might have to do that a couple of times if it's a really cheap scale. To measure powder, we're going to use the RCBS powder measure. Everyone makes one. Hornady has one. I think Lyman has one. Lee definitely has one. Basically, you fill this up with powder. You turn this and it dumps powder into a case or a pan or whatever else you want. And it's adjustable for your charge. This is not super accurate. We measure powder in tenths of a grain. I don't know where grain comes from. I think it is actually a black powder measurement, but there's 7,000 grains in 1 pound, if that's at all interesting to you. And usually we do loads in 0.1 grain increments. This is probably accurate to 0.2 or 0.3 grains. So what it's not good for is if you're loading high precision, you can't use this alone. You have to use something called a powder trickler with it. Or if you're loading hand loads really at the far end, the very maximum, you might have to hand weigh those in conjunction with this. Typically what we will do is weigh this out at the beginning, and then throw all the loads, and then maybe every 10 or 20 rounds just check a weight and see if it's still accurate. Outside of measuring powder, you need to be able to measure case length and overall cartridge length. So you need a caliper. A dial caliper is probably a little more accurate than the really cheap digital calipers, but they're all good enough for what we're doing. Dial caliper will probably run you about $30. Digital calipers for really cheap ones, like $10-15. You should own a bullet puller, probably. You could just, I guess, save your mistakes and take them all apart later and throw everything away or something like that. But you're going to make mistakes at some point, so have something to knock the bullets out with. These are really cheap. You can also get dies that pull specific calibers. Those are really nice if you have a progressive setup. Most of your kits, some of the kits I should say, will come with some kind of hand tools like this. If you don't, they're not make or break item. For pistols, you definitely need it for rifle, especially because they come with these tools for chamfering the inside and outside of the cases, and for swaging primer pockets. But this little primer pocket cleaner is pretty slick. Once you knock out the primer, there'll be some black soot in here, and you can use this to just quickly knock it out. Over time, if you shoot the same case a bunch of times, that can actually build up and cause you some problems with seating your primers. Other tools that we have out here, we're going to hand prime. You can also, almost every press out there has a system for priming on the press. For single stage, it's usually faster to do it on a hand primer like this. They all basically work the same. You drop primers in here and push this lever, and it just pushes them into the case for you. You need your components, which we'll go into real quick. You need your primers. When you follow the load data in your book, use the correct kind of primers. Magnum primers when it says use Magnum primers, small pistol primers when it says small pistol, small rifle, etc. Don't mix and match them. You can probably pretty safely interchange brands, as long as you don't shoot like your maximum load, and you should always load from the starting load and work up your load anyways. But if you change any components out, you probably need to back it off and start again. You're gonna have powder. Fortunately right now, powder is not that hard to find. Primers are a little harder to find. But you know, you're gonna need some kind of powder, you're gonna need some kind of bullets. We're just gonna load 115 grain full metal jackets today, so that'll be pretty straightforward. Also for your dies are not made out of stainless steel, and they will rust. In North Carolina, they will rust sitting in your home, sitting in the press. I've had it happen to all of my dies. So have some kind of protectant, some kind of like film lubricant or something like that. I use the strike hold stuff on everything. You know, just I put a little bit on a rag and then just wipe down the dies after I use them. If you're using them all the time and you can pay attention to them, that's not that big of a deal, but especially if you're storing them for a while, you need to store them with some kind of protectant. A lot of these will come with like, I think this has it. Yeah, a lot of them will come with this kind of like wax paper, oil paper stuff that helps with that also. But I still wipe them down. Now, the only thing that's not on here that you need to have is a tumbler. It's not strictly required. You could like hand polish all your cases. In fact, these are not tumbled because mine died. But the tumbler helps a lot, especially if you're doing a bunch of brass. They're not very expensive, like $50 at Harbor Freight. You pay maybe $150 or so for a nicer one, like a Dillon that I've got coming right now, in fact. But I like vibratory tumblers. We can talk about some other ways to clean brass in the Q&A if we want to, but vibratory tumbler is cheap. It works pretty quick. If you use decent media and some polish, maybe 30, 45 minutes and your brass will be super clean. It's got to be clean before it goes into your sizing die, because it could tear up your die, it could tear up your brass, but also it just won't run smooth and it might even get stuck, okay? I tumble loaded cartridges afterwards because I use lubricant on them. On these kind of like 9mm and straight wall autoloader brass, I use this one-shot stuff. You just throw them in a box and like hit them with a shot of it, shake it around a little bit, hit them again. You don't need it with carbide dies, and we're not going to use it today because I don't have the tumbler right now, but it'll make the carbide dies run smoother as well. That's basically all of the tools I think that we're going to use, and we'll talk a little more through them as we start building our rounds. So, all right, y'all. So next we're going to get into the actual loading portion. Before we do that, I didn't talk about earlier, and I meant to, was some different press kits that you might consider, and different brands that you're probably going to see. If you're looking at progressives, which we're not going to go into a lot of details about, Dillon's probably the big brand, and it's also the more expensive one, but that's kind of the bar that everyone tries to meet or exceed when it comes to progressive presses. The one that kind of competes with Dillon and is a little bit cheaper is the Hornady lock and load press. And that's probably like, so that's the one I'm going to get, for example. And I think that especially if you start out with a Hornady single stage press, you can interchange some parts like the bushings. So it's a pretty nice get up, and it saves you a little bit of money. Also, I'm not sure, I don't remember if I mentioned when you might really want a progressive. I think that the bar for that is probably if you're shooting 500 rounds or more a month of the same caliber. If you're shooting any less than that, you'd probably be just fine on a single stage, because it can go pretty quick once you batch it out. For single stage kits, the RCBS kit, this is an RCBS Rock Chucker Junior, which they don't make anymore, but the Rock Chucker Supreme is kind of their flagship single stage press, and you can get that kit for like $250 or $300, and it comes with your measure and scale and book and stuff like that. The Hornady kit is about the same money. And I think the Hornady might be a little bit of a better deal. That's probably what I would buy today if I was buying a kit. And one of the reasons I would buy it is because I plan on using their progressive again, and it's a bushing press. So you saw earlier, we like screw these dies in and unscrew them, and that's one of the more time-consuming parts of using a single-stage press. Nowadays, several companies have bushing presses, which is you screw the die into a bushing, and then the bushing locks into the press, but then there's some kind of mechanism to quickly unlock it and remove it. Also, another company making a bushing press, and probably like for beginner reloaders in particular, one of the best deals out there right now is the Lee Challenger breech lock, I think it is. If you go to Midway USA, I think it's like $140 for that thing. And that comes with a pretty good single stage press. It's not the most amazing in the world, but it's totally fine for what we're doing, especially with like pistol, or if you're shooting an AR or something like that, like normal ranges. It's a bushing press, so you push a little button and you can pull the whole bushing out, which is pretty cool and such a cheap, such a low cost option. And it comes with a good balance scale. It comes with a powder measure, and the Lee powder measure is really good. I've got one. We won't use it today, but I've got one and I like it a lot. It's super smooth. It comes with a hand priming tool and all that stuff. If you buy it from like RCBS, if you just buy a balance scale from RCBS, that's like $100 scale. If you just buy the Uniflow, which we'll use in a minute, that's like $80. So the Lee kit's really good value. It'll get you started, and a lot of that stuff you'll be able to use for years. I still have a Lee balance scale that I started with, and it works great. It's just it's not quite as fast as using like a digital scale, so that's why we're not using it today. So we're just going to jump right into it. We're only going to load up 5 rounds, so it should go pretty quick. I've got the resizing die in here right now. One thing that we're not going to talk through is how to set up your dies. Different dies have different setup procedures. Every brand's a little bit different. So you need to already have your press and your dies and just read those instructions. The resizing die that we have here is going to resize the case, and at the same time, this has a spent primer in it. So we're going to, this little pin down here is going to push that primer out. That pin, I'll get a different one out for the camera here. That pin is removable. It just comes in a little thing like this. The reason you want to be able to remove it is, 1, sometimes it breaks, and 2, sometimes you don't want to knock the primer out. You can buy new brass with primers already in it, for example, and you might just want to be able to resize that. Or if it's like in my case, I actually knocked the primers out before I tumble, so I just don't need it in there. One thing to know is most of these presses, when they pop that primer out, it's supposed to get caught in this little tray. Sometimes it doesn't. And it'll just fly out somewhere. Some presses have a cool little tube that drops into, and they don't have that problem. If you have a press that takes a tray like this, they might fall out of the tray. And I usually just put a box beneath it to catch them, because you don't want to step on them. And that's it. When you're running through this resizing die, don't get in a rush to do it, especially early on. If something feels wrong, it probably is wrong, and you might get a stuck case, which is a really big pain to get out. So, don't try to force it if it doesn't feel right. It does take some pressure. And if you have any flex, like if this board was hanging off a little ways and this whole thing flexed, it can make it seem a lot harder to get out. And also, flex could be a big problem for you if you do have a stuck case, because when you try to yank on this to get it out, it could actually, and there went some primers, just like I was talking about. When you try to yank on this to get it out, it could actually flex and cause you problems, or even rip off the rim. And then you might have to take your die apart and knock it out, or you might have to send it to the company. So that's the first one. One of the things I was talking about earlier on the Lee dies, this is the lock ring. This is the old style lock rings. They come with a different one now. But the problem with these, one of the reasons I don't like the Lee lock rings is because they don't actually lock in place. And so this goes back to the efficiency I was talking about earlier. If you look at any other die brand, they come with a ring that you can actually screw down and it never moves. So every time you put it in and take it out, it's in the same spot. So like what I've done with these other dies that need a little more precision setup is I've swapped the lock rings on them. If you have a bushing press, like we talked about earlier, you don't need to worry so much about that because you don't take the die in and out. So now that we're resized, we're going to do expanding. The whole point of expanding is, like right now, if I try to put this bullet on here, it doesn't really go in there at all and it might fall out. And also, especially with lead, if it's really tight, it could shave the sides of the lead and make it inaccurate. So we come in here, and these are all already set up. So know that the first time you do this, you're going to have to set them up and check them a little bit. So when we come in here, this is just going to put a little tiny bit of a bell on it. So hopefully that'll just sit in there a little bit. Now what you don't want to do, this is an example. I don't know if it'll show up really well, but this looks almost like a trumpet shape. And if you see a bullet sitting in it, it's really, really wide, right? So you don't want that, and you don't need it. I'm not gonna worry about that bullet. You don't need it. You just need barely enough that your case, that your bullet will sit down in the case, okay? Another thing to mention on this die, and actually most expanding dies, this is a powder through die, which means if you have a setup that has your powder measure automatically dropping powder into it, it can do that at the same time, but you have to have a primer in here first. So I do that step after I expand because I throw powder separately. But if you're using an automatic powder measure, you need to already have your primer in place. So you might do that on the press. Almost every press that exists now has some kind of on-press priming system, or you might do it by hand like we're going to do after this step. Also, one thing to note is you can get these things called loading blocks, which is just like, it kind of looks like the tray that comes in your ammo boxes. And what people will use them for is to separate steps. So after I resize everything, I'll put them in one block, and then as I'm expanding them, I move it to the other block and then move it back for the next step, etc. The main reason you want to do that is because when you get to putting powder in, if you put powder in all the cases at the same time, you don't want to make a mistake and load a bullet into a case that doesn't have powder. The reason we're not using them is because I put powder in at the same time that I load a bullet. So it's just my particular process that doesn't require it. So next we'll throw some primers in here. We'll see if I can do it without dropping any. Oh, actually, even before we put the primers in, we can just really quickly clean out these primer pockets, and you can maybe see on video, how much black stuff comes out. That's all just soot from the primer compound. If you're doing this is fine because we're just doing 5 of them. If you're doing a lot of them, you probably want to do it like over a paper towel or something that you can just wad up and throw away afterwards. So this is going to be a little bit of a pain. One thing that's not super convenient is getting out just a couple of primers at a time. Wear your safety goggles, any step priming or beyond. Most of these trays are smaller and some of these hand priming tools are larger, so it's a little easier to dump an entire box of primers into it. But you can see right now they're not all the same orientation. The cool thing about these trays is they have these little ridges in them, and when you shake the primers, they'll all get knocked up to the correct orientation. And we had one just sitting on the bench there. So if you don't use a hand primer, if you use an on-press primer, you have to buy a separate tray that you can do that with, so they all face, you want all of these to face up. And actually really quickly, when you're looking at them, hopefully this will show up on camera. The inside, there's the cup, which is the outside that cups the primer compound, and the anvil. The anvil is this little 3-prong thing that you'll see when you put the primers in the tray. When you're getting your primers ready, you want to just look really quick and make sure they actually all have anvils, because sometimes they won't have one, and they won't go off if they don't have one. So when I do this, I also orient away from myself. You want even pressure. You don't have to really jam on it too hard. If it's going in too hard, it might have a problem. It might be turned a little bit. And then afterwards, you just want to make sure that it's just barely below flush. You don't want it flush or sticking out. All right, and we can do those. That's fine. See that, and right there, that one actually flipped over, and I felt it right as I was doing it. All right, so there's a little bit of feel to it, and then you also just double check with your eyes afterwards. All right, we can put those back later. Just make sure that they're away from our other loading stuff. So now we have 5 primed, resized, and flared cases, expanded cases, I should say. So the next step will be powder dispensing and bullet seating. And I do this one at a time, the same time. So we put this measure directly in here. A lot of measures will just come with a stand that you put separately on the bench. And either way is really fine. I just happen to like it with this setup. I have that Lee one set up on a stand, and I just clamp it down if I use it. What we'll do, typically what you want to do with this hopper is you kind of want it full. It'll work a little better than if there's not much powder. We're running out of powder, so we'll just use what we have. Wrong lid. Make sure you close that, because what you don't want to do is get this in here some weird way, or get something jammed in there. You fire off a primer and somehow a spark goes inside of there. Very unlikely, but it could happen. So how we're going to do this, first, when you first put your powder in, you need to run this measure 2 or 3 times just to make sure that it's all settled and you'll get the right measurement, okay? Next, what I'll do, if you're measuring in a pan, that's fine. I usually just measure right out of the case on this particular scale. So what we'll do is we'll reset the scale. And I've already looked up the load data that we need in the Hornady book, but actually I don't remember the overall length. So let's just get it set up and double check it. So we'll go to 9mm, 115 grains, and we're doing a little bit of a middle load. All right, so now that scale is set, we'll just test the measure. Now I set this up last night, so it should be pretty much right on the money for us. It's a little higher than I want, but we're still not maxing the load out. Double check that. Yeah, let's just make that a little less. So if these all adjust a little bit differently, but basically you typically screw it in to make the load less and screw it out to do more. And remember, if you change it, you need to resettle it a couple of times before you measure it. All right, let's make sure this is tare correctly is. That should get me right where I want to be. Let's measure that one more time. Another useful tip, different measures behave a little differently when it comes to dropping powder. These drum type measures, like the RCBS measure, you want to use the same force and motion every time, and you can run them pretty quick. Measures like the Lee measure are not quite so dependent on like speed or doing it exactly the same way every time, but they have a kind of cylinder that's filled with powder, so you have to wait a little bit longer to make sure all the powder comes out. So just get to know the tool that you own. Okay, now we're right where I want to be. And try to be very consistent with the way that you use it. All right, so what we'll do is we'll drop powder, we'll look in the case and make sure we have what looks to be an appropriate amount of powder, and then we'll seat our bullets. Okay, and like I said before, these should just barely sit in here without falling out, and this one's going to be a little bit of a pain, and might not go in. If you have it too crooked, like that one's sitting super crooked right now, you can actually mess up the case. It could push in sideways and crumple the case, and then you'll have to throw it out. You probably can't even pull a bullet sometimes. And then what we want to do is just check our overall length and make sure it matches with the book. The book's looking for 1.1 inches, and we're at 1.108. We can come down just a little bit there. Maybe just one more. And it's a little bit of trial and error. Just don't try to go too fast because you'll overshoot it and then you'll have to pull a bullet. And that's 1.101, which I will accept. Something that we can talk about really quickly on your seating die, they'll come with these different types of plungers, and they're designed for different shapes of bullets, right? And so if you use the wrong plunger, two different things can happen. One, it can actually shave part of the bullet off or damage the end of it and cause you some accuracy problems. The other thing is it could shift around in there a little bit and do that same thing we were talking about where it goes in a little funny. Read your die instructions and make sure you have the right one. Most people, if they buy 3 die sets, this is the last step that you're going to do. We're going to have one more just because I use the factory crimp die. But most of the time your crimping operation happens at the same time. And we were like right on the edge of what's a good expansion on these. That's why I have to fiddle with them a little bit to make sure they go in right. So I probably could have adjusted that down just a little bit more. But for the most part, they're sitting in there okay. They don't have to be perfectly straight. The straighter they are, the easier they go in, and also the less likelihood it is that you'll crush a case or something like that. And typically the more accurate it'll be. That matters a lot more for you on rifles. All right, so we got 5 cases there. Now our measure, when we take this off, There's two. There goes our powder. There's two different steps you want to do to get this out. One, dump all this out from the top. Make sure you shake it. All right, and then two, make sure it comes out of the drum. You want to make sure all that powder is out of there, because next time you might use a different powder. Or if you have a bunch of different powders and you leave it in there, say you have this set up not on a die but just on your bench, and you leave it in there, and you come back after a couple of days or a couple of months, you might not remember which powder was in it. All right. So now we'll just run this to the factory crimp die. What this will do for us is on an autoloader pistol, the case mouth is actually where you head space in the firearm. So you use what's called a taper crimp. What it actually does is it doesn't taper it inward, it actually just makes it perfectly straight. Right now it's a little bit of a V. On a revolver, you use what's called a roll crimp, and it actually crimps into a groove on the bullet. So when you're adjusting your crimp for like a 9mm or a 45 or something like that, you don't want it adjusted too far in where it's actually like squishing into the bullet. Now this one was one that I think was a little awkward going in, and when we run it through that factory crimp die, I felt a little bit of resistance. So it probably actually, that bullet was probably just a little bit bigger. And that one too. All right, and so now we have 5 loaded cartridges. And that's basically what there is to it. Thanks, we'll talk to you guys in the comments.
Wow, that was definitely rich. Thank you so much, Cap, for taking the time to provide us with that content and that information as it relates to ammo reloading. Many of you guys already know, and you've already seen and experienced the prices of ammo and the drastic increases due to the shortage. I guess it's the age-old saying about supply and demand. And so again, Cap, thank you for taking that time. Listen, thank you also for joining us for this monthly meeting that we had for the Triangle, North Carolina Gun Club and for the Triangle chapter of NAAGA. We want to continue to encourage that if you have any questions, to definitely feel free to reach out to us through our Facebook fan page, which is Triangle NC Gun Club. And definitely feel free to reach out to us somewhere. We're out there on Instagram. We're also on YouTube. But many of you also have our email address, which will also be included and provided for you in the banner below. Having said that, Cap is going to go live on our Facebook page right now. So I'm actually going to get out the way so that he can answer some of the questions that you may have absorbed throughout the process of his presentation. So log on to the Triangle NC Gun Club Facebook fan page and learn some more. Thanks, Cap. We'll see you all next month. Cap, take it away. Again.